Have you heard about the Latina health paradox? Well, before I explain what it is, let me describe a little bit of what sociologists do. Sociologists basically take three predominant tools. One is to look at data. They also read a bunch of theorists, and they also do their own research, usually predominantly by conducting surveys. And what researchers started to find in the 60s and 70s and up until today, is that a lot of first generation Latino immigrants have really good health indicators when they compare the data, they compare statistics to white individuals with high educational attainment in the US. And there's a couple of different ways to measure the Latina health paradox, but about, I'd say about 12 years ago, I was reading some papers in grad school about a specific way of measuring the Latina health paradox. So a lot of Latina women who immigrate to the U.S. and give birth in the U.S. have a very, very low infant mortality rate, even lower than counterparts of white women that have a very high education, very high income. Okay, so first let me talk about what mortality rate is. When I'm talking about mortality rate, I'm talking about the rate of babies that die during childbirth. So for Latino women that were immigrating to the U.S., escaping impoverished countries, one of the things that researchers found that was that on average, the rate of infant mortality, babies that would die during birth, was significantly lower than when they compared the statistics to a comparable rate of white women with high education, high income. So this was one of the first questions. Was these are privileged women in the U.S. that have had good nutrition, good health care, and we're comparing these stats with women that are leaving, who have just left countries where they might have, we don't really know anything about these women, but we're speculating that maybe they might have had lots of stress in their life. We don't know anything about what they had in terms of access to health care. We don't know anything about whether or not they had food insecurity, but we do know that they have a lower level of income, and you can speculate what their living conditions would be like. Now, the paradox gets even more confusing when longitudinal studies started to be done. And researchers found that for these first generation immigrants, their daughters, second generation women, actually the infant mortality rate for their daughters basically doubled. So 12 years ago, I'm in grad school, and I was on a way to a prayer retreat, and I'm trying to do a bunch of readings, and I'm sharing the car with a woman who was doing like IT in hospital administration. And I'm also sharing the car with a woman who's working on her certification as a certified direct entry midwife. So this midwife who I'm traveling with says, I can tell you exactly what's happening. And she said, it's actually the culture of hospitals that doesn't really allow for normal birth. And she started to give me some other statistics, like about medical interventions and the fact that OBGYNs were statistically more likely to perform a cesarean section at like 4 o'clock on a Friday than at any other time. and were more likely to perform a C-section prior to going on vacation than any other time. And I thought that was an interesting observation. And in grad school, you're supposed to kind of, in addition to doing the readings, be prepared to discuss, maybe do a little bit more background research before you come into class the next day to discuss the passages with your colleagues. And so I decided to kind of look into what she had said with a little bit more detail. And so that's when, upon doing some more research, I read about Emanuel Friedman and the Friedman curve. And one of the things that I learned was that basically what we know of about contractions, the reason why we measure contractions, is just because Emanuel Friedman decided to measure women's contractions and had kind of like a correlation between how frequent women experience contractions and how dilated she was, and kind of measured on average how long, like, these, said that, like, maybe these were indicators, and to measure how long it would take for a woman to give birth, depending on how far apart her contractions were and how dilated she was. And somewhere along the way, this became a standard practice, actually, in medical institutions, was to measure these things. And if the women didn't conform to, these metrics, then some people started saying, like, oh, well, then she needs some kind of medical intervention. We're going to go ahead and give, these women some Pitocin to speed up their birth. And then that ends up triggering another cannonball of medical interventions, sometimes escalating to the point where you end up having to conduct a C-section to save the baby. And this story, or this trend, was very interesting to me, because I was supposed to be, as a graduate student, choosing theorists and choosing a theory that I was going to do more research in and contribute to. I was supposed to be deciding on, after I passed my comprehensive exams, I was supposed to choose a topic for what I wanted to research. And I'm supposed to be very well grounded in all of the social theories. And I'm supposed to state how my research is going to specifically advance knowledge in this specific theoretical tradition, whatever theoretical tradition I choose. And a lot of the theorists that I was attracted to were very critical of American culture. There were postmodern theorists that were very critical of the American culture, basically because of these trends that happened as a result of Fordism, which was basically just industrialization. But they stated, like theorists like Pierre Bourdieu, and one of my my professors that I had in college, Stepan Mestrovic, they would talk about how the problem is that this culture that we've created of wanting things to be very, very efficient is anything but. We've sort of omitted humanity from the systems. And George Herbert Ritzer wrote about the McDonaldization of America. And there's a lot of people that were just very, very critical of the systems that have been created and the way that this has sort of created this, like, standardized suburban culture, 8 to 5 work culture. You work, and then, you eventually you get married, you move to the suburbs, and your entertainment basically is just another form of consumption, and you consume and you consume and you consume and you die. I liked all of these readings, and there was something about it that I felt was very true. And at the same time, I'm basically being taught by a couple of brilliant professors, Owen Hooley and Kristen Barker. And I was also very, very drawn to literature about social constructionism, about the extent to which a lot of the systems that we participate in were created by humans. And so that had me questioning things about, about trying to really think critically about the fact that these problems are human created problems. Because a system has been created that doesn't actually account for the range of human behavior. And so here I am. I'm a graduate student. I'm fascinated by this research topic, trying to figure out, cool, how am I going to choose which theorists I want to study for my comprehensive exams, and how am I going to choose, the topic that I'm going to focus on when I'm ready to do my dissertation proposal. And, I had written a paper, and I went to the American Sociological Association conference in New York that year and participated in a roundtable and met some interesting people. And there's someone who I met, I don't even remember his name, but he said, "Be careful what you choose to study." He said, because you will become your research. And I was just kind of listening to him like, okay. And he said, I had a professor, famous professor. You've probably read him in your books. He was studying suicide. He killed himself. I was like, okay, so I went home and I've, kind of reflected on that, and I thought, okay, I don't know how to use that, how to apply that. And then I think I was 33 at the time, and I had read enough to know that if I was going to have a baby, it was now or never. Because once you approach 35, that's when you start to be added to a higher risk category. And all of these medical interventions, all of these standardized practices from this system that I want to engage in critically, it's gonna make some of those choices for me. So, my husband and I decided to start our family. And so I gave birth to a beautiful baby boy at a baby-friendly hospital at the age of 34. And that little baby was so colicky, crying, constantly, needing to be breastfed every 2 hours for the entire first year of his life. I went back to school that fall, and for the first time in my graduate career, barely squeaked by. Basically made C's and D's in my classes. And that pretty much determined that I couldn't continue. I basically had to choose between being a mom, and I had to choose my PhD. I was at a crossroads. I chose being a mom over completing my PhD. So basically my husband and I packed up, moved to San Antonio, Texas, and I became financially dependent on my husband. So, about a year or two into trying to adjust to a new home in a new community with a demanding baby, with a husband who's working 70 hours a week, not being able to work on my own, my husband would come home and I would have struggled so hard to just get dishes washed, or just get a single room cleaned. And I could hardly do anything. I could basically only just keep my son alive. That's the only thing I could realistically accomplish with my time. And I would ask my husband, could you cook dinner? And after dinner, can you wash the dishes? And he'd say, yes, that's fine. And, as soon as dinner was over, I had to go crawl back into bed, breastfeed my son. And before you know it, it's midnight and my husband's still washing dishes. 1 o'clock in the morning, still washing dishes. 2 o'clock in the morning, still washing dishes. And, I would, go and, ask him, what's going on? And he's like, I'm just getting started. I'm like, what do you mean just getting started? Just wash the dishes. And this was like a fight that would continue for like 6 months. And there was one night in particular. I mean, I'm exhausted. I can hardly do anything. And I'm starting to realize the extent to which before we had our baby, a lot of the work that we're doing here at any housework, cooking, cleaning, any emotional labor, the burden for our financial sustainability, all of this stuff. I was basically doing the adulting for both of us. And, and we had fights throughout our marriage. Every time I would notice that, I would kind of sort of assume that it was like, the patriarchy or weaponized incompetence or something. So we would get into these fights, and there was a moment in which one night we're about to have a fight. And it's like I heard the voice of God whisper in my ear, ADHD. And I told my husband, I said, we need to really learn what ADHD is. So a few months later, we would drain all of the money from our savings account and go get tested for ADHD. And after we both tested and realized that we both had ADHD, we took basically these test results to our physician. And our physician said, okay, you're breastfeeding, so I can't prescribe any medication to you. I looked at my husband and prescribed him a stimulant-based medication. Well, after a few months on this medication, we discovered that my husband's blood pressure, which we knew was high, was so high that if he continued to receive medication, he would be at risk of stroke. So he basically said, okay, well, I'll give you, Wellbutrin or something like that, but you can't use a stimulant-based medication. And to this day, that is the closest thing that we've ever received to any kind of intervention or any kind of supportive service for us to learn about ADHD and manage our life. And so for the past 10 years, we've been primarily a one-income family living at the poverty level. When I was 9 months pregnant with my daughter, I went to the county courthouse and I registered a DBA for our handyman business. And I started getting my husband some handyman work. And we've been subsisting off of handyman work for 6 years. But everything kind of collapsed this past summer when every project that we had on our table was completely mismanaged. One of the problems that my husband has had consistently with running the business is not getting change of work orders. He might have an inaccurate estimate, and he would work and work and work and work. The worst of it was when he worked for a house flipper for a whole month, and we never received a dime from the house flipper. We would be so slow with getting estimates out the door. We'd be so slow with collecting invoices on a regular basis. And periodically this would create cash flow problems with us. What does this have to do with anything? Well, the thing is, I started to really realize, like, after the horrible summer that we had, that us being self-employed only did one thing. It only stabilized our employment history. It didn't stabilize our income. And the reason why it didn't stabilize our income was because of the fact that we were trying to replicate, standardize processes for neurotypical businesses that don't necessarily apply to us. Our problems with our business have nothing to do with our talent or our competency in our field, has nothing to do with our intellectual understanding of financial management. It has to do with the actual execution of certain things on a consistent basis, and accounting for a range in a way of thinking. And so that is what I am currently trying to do. I recently reached out to colleagues that I had when I was attempting my PhD in sociology. I reached out to colleagues in economics. I reached out to colleagues that are studying psychology. And I asked a lot of my colleagues, like, all right, if me as a business owner decide that instead of seeing neurodiversity as a problem, I'm going to see it as an asset. So let's say that me as a business owner, I'm going to make a choice to not see neurodiversity as a problem. I'm going to see it as an asset. And I'm going to create a new way of creating a system that doesn't treat deviations in human behavior as a problem or as a pathology. I'm going to treat it as an asset. How do I do that? That's what I'm currently working on, and that's something that I would love to share with you guys.